There is a man buried in an unmarked debt in Dutch history books who was cursed by his own people in a ceremony so brutal that no one was allowed to speak to him again. Not his mother, not his brother, not a single friend from childhood. Candles were extinguished one by one while the curse was read aloud, symbolizing the light of his soul being snuffed out forever. He was 23 years old, and his crime wasn't murder or theft or violence. His crime was a sentence, 4 words that would take 3 centuries to fully understand: God or nature. 2 words that meant exactly the same thing. 250 years later, a rabbi wrote a telegram to the most famous scientist alive and asked him a question that had haunted humanity forever. Do you believe in God? Albert Einstein didn't answer with yes or no. He answered with a name. He said he believed in Spinoza's God, the God who reveals himself in the harmony of everything that exists, not a God who cares about the fate of individual human beings. That single reply turned a forgotten, excommunicated lens grinder into one of the most quietly influential minds in the history of thought. So who was this man? And why did an idea this simple terrify an entire continent? Before we get into his life, look up at the sky tonight if you can. It never fully feels real, does it? Those points of light are too distant, too old, too impossibly large for the mind to hold on to. Thousands of suns scattered across a darkness with no edges. And yet something in you recognizes them anyway, like a memory older than your own life. That's not a coincidence. That's chemistry. The calcium holding your skeleton together, the iron carrying oxygen through your blood, the very air filling your lungs right now. None of it originated on Earth. It was cooked inside dying stars billions of years before this planet even existed, then scattered across the galaxy in violent explosions, drifting for eons until gravity pulled it into the shape that eventually became you. For one brief, flickering moment in the 14 billion year story of the universe, that scattered stardust organized itself into something capable of standing still and staring back up at where it came from. The universe became aware of itself. And that, in essence, is the philosophy Baruch Spinoza spent his entire life and lost his entire world trying to explain. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632, into a city standing on the edge of 2 worlds. His family were Sephardic Jews, refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition, a period when Jews across the Iberian Peninsula were tortured, burned, or forced into fake conversions just to survive. Amsterdam had become one of the only places in Europe willing to let them exist openly. It wasn't tolerance out of kindness. It was tolerance out of necessity, built on trade and commerce. But for a community that had just escaped annihilation, religion wasn't a personal choice. It was the thread holding everyone together. To question it publicly wasn't just controversial. It was dangerous to the survival of the entire community, and Spinoza, of all people, was expected to become one of its brightest defenders. He was quiet, precise, and unnervingly intelligent, the kind of student rabbis point to as proof that their teachings will outlive them. He studied Hebrew scripture, Jewish law, and philosophy with a seriousness that impressed everyone around him. But somewhere in his late teens, the question started. Was scripture meant to be read literally or symbolically? Did God actually intervene in the lives of individuals, or was that just a comforting story? Were miracles real events, or misunderstood natural ones? Was the soul actually immortal, or was that simply what people needed to believe to face death? Today, those questions sound like dorm room philosophy. In the 1650s, they were an act of war against the entire structure of belief. Because what Spinoza was really attacking wasn't a specific ritual or a specific rule. He was attacking the picture almost everyone carried in their head of what God even was. A king above the clouds, watching, judging, punishing, rewarding, listening to prayers like a ruler hearing petitions from his subjects. Spinoza looked at that picture and reached a conclusion that would end up defining the rest of his life. That image wasn't God. It was humanity, staring into a mirror and mistaking its own reflection for the face of the divine. People couldn't imagine a reality that didn't revolve around them, so they built a God who did. For Spinoza, the universe wasn't run by a ruler making decisions. It ran on necessity. Stars moved because of physical law, not divine mood. Storms formed from atmospheric pressure, not celestial anger. Human behavior emerged from long, invisible chains of cause and effect, not from a soul freely choosing in a vacuum. There was no hand reaching down from outside reality to bend the rules whenever someone prayed hard enough. And this idea, more than anything else, shattered the emotional safety net an entire civilization had been resting on. If nothing intervenes, suffering isn't part of some grand moral lesson. If miracles don't exist, the universe isn't listening to your prayers. If humanity isn't the reason creation happened, then we are not, in fact, the main character of reality. You'd expect a philosophy like that to feel bleak, cold, nihilistic even. But almost everyone who has actually sat with Spinoza's ideas describes the opposite reaction. Because if God isn't separate from the universe, then nothing is separate from God either. Every rock, every ocean, every animal, every person becomes part of the same single, infinite, unfolding reality. The wall between you and everything doesn't just get thinner, it disappears. You stop being a lonely accident trapped inside a hostile cosmos. You become an expression of that cosmos, temporarily wearing a human shape. This is exactly why thinkers across 3 centuries couldn't stop arguing about him. Hegel once said you are either a Spinozist or you are not a philosopher at all. Nietzsche respected his rejection of a moralizing, judgmental universe. Freud saw the roots of his own theory of hidden, unconscious motivation sitting inside Spinoza's work 100 years before psychology existed as a field. Physicists and neuroscientists today still find themselves circling back to his description of an interconnected, lawful cosmos almost by accident. But none of that mattered to the people around him in 1656. At 23 years old, the leaders of Amsterdam's Jewish community issued the harshest writ of excommunication in the congregation's history. It's still uncomfortable to read today. It cursed him in his coming in and his going out, by day and by night, lying down and rising up. No one was permitted to speak with him, read anything he wrote, do business with him, or come within roughly 6 feet of him. His own family was expected to disown him completely, and largely did. There was no appeal process, no path back. It's hard to fully feel the weight of that from where we sit now. In the 17th century, being cut off from your community wasn't an inconvenience. It was closer to a death sentence. It meant no protection, no income, no legal standing, no one to turn to if things went wrong. Spinoza lost every relationship he had ever known because he refused to stop asking honest questions. And still, by every account, he didn't respond with rage or bitterness. He simply left. He supported himself by grinding optical lenses for microscopes and telescopes, lived modestly, avoided fame on purpose, and published much of his most important writing anonymously, because he understood exactly how dangerous his ideas were considered. At least one religious extremist tried to stab him in the street. He kept a torn coat from the attempted assassination as a quiet reminder of what his ideas cost. And he kept writing anyway, because he had become convinced that human beings were suffering from a single enormous misunderstanding, that they were separate. Separate from nature, separate from each other, separate from God. At the heart of everything he built stands one short Latin phrase that reads almost like poetry until you understand what it actually implies. Deus sive Natura. God or nature. Not God who made nature. Not nature that reflects God's glory. God and nature as the exact same thing, viewed from 2 different angles. To understand how radical that was, picture the worldview Spinoza was born into. Reality, in the popular imagination, had 2 separate layers stacked on top of each other. God existed above the universe as its outside creator and ruler. Human beings existed below, souls temporarily borrowing physical bodies. Nature sat in between, almost like a machine God had built and then stepped back to observe. Spinoza looked at that entire structure and asked one deceptively simple question. If God is genuinely infinite, how could anything possibly exist outside of God? The moment you claim something exists independently of the divine, you've just placed a boundary around it. And an infinite being, by definition, cannot have a boundary. Take a second and actually sit with that. Any division you draw creates a limit, and limits are the one thing true infinity cannot survive. So Spinoza followed that logic to its natural conclusion. There can only be a single infinite substance in all of existence, one reality containing everything within itself, with nothing standing outside it. Some call that substance God. Others call it nature. Different names, same thing. Philosophers now call this idea substance monism, the belief that behind all the apparent variety we see, reality is, at its foundation, one continuous thing. Picture the ocean. From the surface, you see individual waves, one crashing violently against rock, another rolling gently through open water, each one looking like its own separate event. But no wave is actually independent. Every wave is simply the ocean, temporarily taking on a shape. For Spinoza, you are a wave. You feel separate because your mind draws a border around your body, your memories, your name, your story. But that border is a convenient fiction, not a fact about reality. You are, in truth, inseparable from the endless web of causes surrounding you and running through you. And you don't even need philosophy to see this. Biology proves it. Every breath depends on oceans and forests you'll never visit. Every thought running through your mind right now depends on language, culture, history, and physics, stretching back billions of years before your birth. Nothing about you is self-contained. You are the entire universe, unfolding itself into one particular, temporary shape, for one particular, temporary amount of time. Spinoza called these temporary shapes modes, finite expressions of the one infinite substance. Humans are modes, so are animals, galaxies, storms, memories, and civilizations. This reframing also let him solve a problem that had tortured philosophers for a century before him: how consciousness and matter relate to each other. Descartes had argued the mind and the body were two totally separate substances, and then spent the rest of his career failing to explain how something immaterial could push around something physical. Spinoza rejected the question itself, because he rejected the separation underneath it. Mind and matter, he argued, aren't different substances at all. They're two different attributes of the exact same underlying reality, like looking at a single coin from two different sides. One face shows thought, the other shows extension, meaning physical matter occupying space. Every event has both a physical dimension and a mental one, running in perfect parallel, because they were never two things to begin with. Your thoughts aren't floating somewhere outside nature, watching it from a distance. Your thoughts are nature, doing what nature does. This is part of why Spinoza feels almost unsettlingly modern. Neuroscience keeps confirming that thought, emotion, and decision-making emerge from physical processes inside the brain rather than descending from somewhere immaterial. Psychology keeps revealing how much of human behavior is shaped by forces outside conscious awareness. Ecology keeps proving how deeply interdependent living systems actually are. Piece by piece, modern science keeps abandoning the idea of isolated things and replacing it with a picture of interconnected processes. The exact picture Spinoza arrived at through pure reasoning centuries earlier, with no laboratory at all. He even split nature into two aspects with names that sound strange in English but are worth knowing. Natura naturans, naturing nature, the active, eternal process generating reality moment by moment, and Natura naturata, natured nature, everything that process produces, rivers, stars, animals, you, me. Think of the first as the underlying source code of existence, and the second as everything that code renders on screen. Nothing sits outside this system. There's no supernatural layer interrupting it from above. No outside creator pausing the rules whenever someone begs hard enough for an exception. Everything follows, necessarily, from what reality already is. And here's the part most people get wrong about Spinoza. He didn't experience that necessity as depressing. He experienced it as beautiful. Most human suffering, he argued, comes from judging the universe through the narrow lens of personal desire, calling something good simply because it benefits us, and evil simply because it doesn't. But from the perspective of the universe itself, none of that is a meaningful category. Stars explode, species evolve, empires rise and collapse into dust. People fall in love, grieve, create art, start wars, and eventually die. None of it is an interruption of reality. All of it is reality expressing itself. This reframing quietly rewires your sense of identity if you actually let it sink in. You stop picturing yourself as a lonely ego dropped into a hostile, alien universe and start seeing yourself as a local, temporary expression of the exact same forces shaping everything else. The atoms in your body were forged inside stars that died before the sun existed. The oxygen in your lungs has already passed through the lungs of countless other living things. Your consciousness is the product of billions of years of evolution compressed into a single lifetime. The line separating you from the universe gets thinner every time you actually look at it closely, and this is exactly why religious authorities were so frightened of him. Once God becomes identical with nature, the comforting, human-shaped God most people grew up praying to quietly starts to vanish. That version of God listens, judges, forgives, gets angry, plays favorites, and personally intervenes. Traditional religion frames the universe as an ongoing moral drama with humanity as its main character. Spinoza took that entire drama apart. His God has no anger and no affection because both require change, and change implies imperfection, and nothing can provoke an infinite being that has nothing outside itself. There's no chosen nation, no personal plan for any one individual, no cosmic favoritism. Reality follows its own laws with total indifferent consistency, whether people approve of the results or not. Some religious leaders of his time called him the Prince of Atheists, accusing him of secretly trying to destroy faith itself. But the people who actually sat down and read him tended to walk away with the opposite reaction. Instead of erasing spirituality, Spinoza expanded it until it became something vast, impersonal, and strangely sacred. The Romantic poet Novalis called him the God-intoxicated man, because there really is something overwhelming about a universe where every star, every living thing, every law of physics is treated as an expression of the divine rather than something separate from it. In Spinoza's cosmos, there's no wall between the spiritual and the material anymore. Reality itself is holy, exactly as it is. This is also almost certainly what Einstein was pointing to when he chose Spinoza's name over any other. Einstein rejected the idea of a personal God pulling strings behind the scenes, but he never stopped feeling genuine awe at the mathematical order humming beneath the universe. He once described his own religion as a humble admiration for the structure of the world, so far as science could uncover it, which is almost a direct echo of Spinoza. Written 250 years apart, by two men who never had the chance to meet. Spinoza would have understood that feeling instantly, because it's the same feeling he built his entire philosophy around, and it's worth pausing on how strange that connection actually is. A 20th-century physicist working with curved space and the speed of light reached back across 3 centuries to a lens grinder with no laboratory, no telescope, and no formal scientific training, and found in him the closest thing to a kindred mind he'd ever encounter in the history of philosophy. Spinoza never set out to write religious propaganda. His 2 major works, the theological political treatise and the ethics, were built with the discipline of a mathematician rather than a preacher. The ethics in particular reads almost like a geometry textbook. Definitions, then axioms, then propositions, each one proven step by step from what came before, the exact way you'd prove a theorem instead of arguing a belief. That structure was completely deliberate. Spinoza wanted to demonstrate that his conclusions about God, nature, and human freedom weren't feelings or opinions dressed up as philosophy. He wanted them to follow with the same cold inevitability as 2 + 2 = 4. Whether or not you ultimately agree with where the logic lands, that architecture is part of why the book unsettled so many people. You couldn't simply wave it away as blasphemy. You had to actually locate the flaw in the reasoning, step by step, and for 300 years. Philosophers who set out to refute him have struggled to do exactly that. And still, his logic came with consequences that dismantled centuries of religious tradition. Miracles, in Spinoza's universe, simply cannot happen, because a miracle would require nature contradicting its own essence. Water into wine, seas parting, the dead walking again. Spinoza argued none of it makes logical sense. Because if natural law is an expression of God's own nature, breaking that law would mean God working against himself. What people call a miracle, he believed, is usually just an event whose actual cause they don't yet understand. Ancient humans saw lightning and imagined divine fury, simply because they lacked the science to explain electricity. The less a culture understands nature, the more it fills the gaps with fear and superstition. That logic reshaped how he saw prayer, too. Most religious prayer assumes an all-powerful being can be persuaded to bend reality around individual wishes, victory in battle, protection from illness, financial success, a loved one's recovery. Spinoza saw this as a quiet form of narcissism, the assumption that the entire structure of existence should rearrange itself around one person's private hopes. That sounds harsh out of context, but his intent wasn't cruelty. He believed people cling to fantasies of control because uncertainty terrifies them, and religion often soothes that terror with promises of cosmic fairness. Real peace, in his view, could only come from understanding reality as it actually is, governed entirely by cause and effect, stretching back infinitely through time. A storm forms because of atmospheric pressure. A war breaks out because of politics, economics, fear, and flawed human psychology. Wisdom begins the moment you stop seeing yourself as separate from that chain and start recognizing yourself as one link inside it. At the center of that chain sits one of Spinoza's most important ideas. Conatus, the drive every living thing has to keep existing. Plants stretch towards sunlight. Animals fight to survive. Humans chase safety, love, recognition, pleasure, meaning. And underneath all of that complexity is the same basic force pushing everything forward, the will to persist and express itself. Conatus isn't something added on top of life. For Spinoza, it is life. It's not a trait you possess among others. Your drive to continue existing is the actual structure of what you are. This is also why emotions occupy such a central place in his system. They aren't random spiritual disturbances, and they aren't moral failures either. They're signals, tracking changes in your capacity to exist and act in the world. Joy shows up when something strengthens your vitality. Sadness shows up when something weakens it. Love is the joy of connecting that feeling to an external cause. Hate is its mirror image. Spinoza approached emotion almost like a scientist, treating it as a natural phenomenon with understandable causes rather than a mysterious force descending from outside the self. That was genuinely radical for his era when anger, lust, envy, and fear were mostly framed as sins or signs of a weak soul. Spinoza saw them instead as effects with traceable causes. Insecurities, past experiences, environmental triggers, physical states. Understanding those causes, he believed, mattered far more than moralizing about them. But that logic leads straight into one of the most uncomfortable questions in all of philosophy. If everything has a prior cause, what happens to free will? Spinoza's answer is still one of the most disquieting ideas he ever put on paper. In the absolute sense most people imagine it, he argued, free will simply doesn't exist. People feel free because they experience their desires from the inside without ever seeing the enormous, invisible chain of causes producing those desires in the first place. He gives the example of a stone thrown through the air. If that stone were somehow conscious, it might genuinely believe it was choosing to fly forward, entirely unaware of the hand and the force that actually launched it. You believe you freely chose your ambitions, your beliefs, your fears, your attractions, your opinions, but look closely enough, and every one of them traces back to influences you never actually picked. You didn't choose your genetics, your native language, your childhood, the century you were born into, or the culture quietly shaping how you interpret everything around you. Modern neuroscience has since found that brain activity linked to a decision often begins before a person becomes consciously aware of making it. A discovery Spinoza essentially predicted 300 years before an MRI machine existed, but he never meant this as an invitation to fatalism or despair. He believed understanding causation was, paradoxically, the actual path toward freedom. Picture someone consumed by rage. In the moment, it feels like power. Spinoza would say the opposite is true. That person is completely unfree, entirely controlled by a state they didn't choose and can't see past. The same applies to greed, obsession, and compulsive behavior of any kind. When something outside you is fully dictating what happens inside you, you're not acting, you're being acted upon. Spinoza drew a sharp line between passive emotion, which controls you when you don't understand its source, and active understanding, which loosens that grip. Someone insults you online, and your entire day dissolves into replaying the argument in your head. That's a passive state. Your inner world is being run by something external. But the moment you start tracing the causes behind someone's cruelty, back through their own insecurities, wounds, and conditioning, that person becomes understandable instead of simply infuriating. It doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It changes your relationship to it. Spinoza believed that once people genuinely understood the forces shaping human behavior, compassion would follow almost automatically, replacing a moral system built entirely on blame and punishment with one built on knowledge and cooperation. Imagine getting caught in a rough current with no understanding of the ocean. Every wave feels random and terrifying. Now imagine an experienced sailor caught in that same current, someone who understands tides, wind, and pressure systems. The water hasn't changed, but knowledge has completely changed how they move through it. That, for Spinoza, is what real freedom looks like. Not standing outside the laws of nature, but understanding them clearly enough to move with them, instead of thrashing blindly against them. That understanding leads toward what Spinoza considered the highest possible state a human mind can reach, seeing life under the aspect of eternity. Most people live from an extremely narrow vantage point. The ego treats every event as personal. A single criticism can feel catastrophic. A failed plan can feel like the universe collapsing. Human beings are wired to place themselves at the center of everything happening around them, and Spinoza believed that narrow lens is the true root of most suffering. When you're fully fused with your ego, life becomes one continuous emotional storm, clinging to pleasure out of fear of pain, exploding into anger at every obstacle, drowning in anxiety because everything feels fragile and temporary. But there's another way of seeing, according to Spinoza, stepping back mentally until your individual life becomes one small thread inside a much larger fabric. You start seeing humanity as one expression of nature among countless others. Civilizations rising and collapsing across centuries, ecosystems shifting across millions of years, stars collapsing and exploding, scattering the exact elements that would one day become living things. You begin to understand that your body is built from matter older than this planet. Instead of experiencing yourself as an isolated creature fighting against reality, you start experiencing yourself as reality, quietly unfolding through you. This was never meant to produce apathy or detachment. It was meant to do the opposite, to make life fuller, not smaller. Because once you stop filtering everything through ego, hatred becomes much harder to sustain. Hatred depends on treating other people as fundamentally alien, permanently evil, entirely separate from yourself. Spinoza's philosophy dissolves that wall completely. The person you resent, fear, or envy is simply another mode of the exact same infinite substance you're made of, shaped, like you, by causes stretching far beyond their conscious control. None of this means ignoring injustice or excusing real cruelty. Spinoza took human suffering seriously, but he believed understanding the causes behind cruelty makes real compassion possible, without ever slipping into naivety. All of this leads to what might be Spinoza's most quietly beautiful idea, the intellectual love of God. It sounds religious in the traditional sense, but Spinoza means something entirely different by it. The intellectual love of God is simply the joy that comes from genuinely understanding reality. The emotional experience of perceiving how deeply everything is connected. It's the feeling you get standing under a sky untouched by city lights, staring up at the Milky Way stretched across the darkness. It's the feeling that hits you in front of a mountain range too vast to properly take in with your eyes. It's the chill that runs through you when a piece of music is so precise and so beautiful that your inner monologue simply stops. It's the quiet awe of finally understanding a scientific idea, the golden ratio, quantum entanglement, the architecture of a black hole, and realizing how strange and elegant reality actually is underneath the surface. These moments are hard to put into words. Awi, smallness that somehow doesn't feel diminishing. Insignificance paired, impossibly, with meaning. The ego shrinks, and existence somehow feels larger at exactly the same time. Spinoza believed this feeling could become more than a fleeting moment, that with enough understanding, it could become a stable, ongoing way of relating to the world. There are striking echoes here of philosophies developed on the other side of the planet, entirely independent of him. In Advaita Vedanta, the individual self is ultimately identical with the universal consciousness underlying all reality. In Buddhism, suffering arises from clinging to the illusion of a separate, permanent self. In Taoism, the goal is harmony with the natural flow of existence rather than resistance to it. Spinoza reached remarkably similar conclusions through pure logic and reason, sitting alone in a rented room in Holland, with no meditation, no mysticism, no contact with any of those traditions at all. When Spinoza died in 1677, he left behind no church, no temple, no organized movement, no congregation gathering weekly to honor his vision of a unified universe. And yet, centuries later, his ideas are still being read, still being argued over, while most of the institutions that condemned him have long since faded into footnotes. That survival means something. The modern world often feels psychologically fractured. People experience themselves as isolated individuals, cut off from nature, from each other, and often from their own minds. Technology promises connection and quietly produces the opposite. Social media turns identity into a performance judged by strangers. Consumer culture manufactures endless comparison and dissatisfaction. We are more technologically connected than any generation in human history, and somehow lonelier than almost any generation before us. Political tribes grow more hostile, more incapable of understanding one another every single year. Underneath nearly all of it sits the exact illusion Spinoza spent his entire life dismantling, the illusion of separateness. The belief that humans stand apart from nature instead of inside it, that individuals exist in total isolation, that entire nations can chase endless self-interest without any consequence, that the ego belongs at the center of reality. Spinoza doesn't offer an easy fix for any of that. What he offers is far harder. A vision where every living thing belongs to the same unfolding process, where understanding gradually replaces hatred, where freedom comes from knowledge instead of control, and where spirituality is found not by escaping the universe, but by finally recognizing that you were never separate from it in the first place. That doesn't mean tolerating injustice or abandoning compassion. Spinoza spent his life defending democracy, free speech, and intellectual liberty at a time when all three could get you killed. He believed a society built on genuine understanding of human nature would always outlast one built purely on fear and punishment. It's worth remembering that his ideas didn't win quickly or cleanly. For nearly a century after his death, Spinoza's name was still spoken of as a warning rather than an inspiration, a byword for atheism that respectable thinkers distanced themselves from even while quietly reading him in private. It took the German Romantics, and later the Enlightenment philosophers building the intellectual case for secular democracy, to start rehabilitating him publicly. Piece by piece, his insistence that religious and political authority should never be allowed to control what a person is permitted to think became quiet foundations underneath modern free societies. The idea that a government has no business policing belief, that scripture can be studied as a historical document without that study being treated as heresy, that reason and faith don't have to be at war with each other. All of that traces back, at least in part, to a man who died with almost nothing to his name, in a rented room, at the age of 44. from a lung disease likely worsened by years of breathing in glass dust from the lenses he ground for a living. And maybe that's exactly why his four-word phrase still matters. 3.5 centuries after it got a young man permanently erased from his own community. You are not a disconnected observer drifting through an alien universe. You are built from the same stardust as the galaxies you're staring up at. Your mind emerged from the exact same processes that produced black holes, oceans, and everything in between. The line separating you from the rest of reality is thinner than it has ever felt. For one brief, flickering moment, the universe arranged a portion of itself into someone capable of asking questions about its own existence. Someone capable of standing outside on a clear night and feeling something close to recognition, looking up at lights that are, in the most literal sense possible, made of exactly the same thing you are. You were never separate from the universe. You are the universe, quietly experiencing itself, one lifetime at a time. Deus, sive, Natura, God, or nature. Two words for the same infinite thing, and for one brief moment through you, that thing opened its eyes.